The TNT Shop has great gift ideas for your furry family member at TNTRadio.live. Today's News Talk Radio, TNT with Trish Wood.
I love it when Patrick goes after people. That was really funny. I'm sure nobody cares if these guys leave Twitter. See ya. Don't let the door hit ya. You know where on the way out. Bye now. Pretty funny. Yeah, they're all doing that, aren't they? I mean, we don't want to be part of something that actually cares about free speech. No, we don't. We're not going to participate in that. Look at how they're exposing themselves, people. I mean, it's just absurd. It is absurd. And it makes you wonder. This is why we can all go a little bit crazy, like I was talking about with Karen in the first hour. Like, do they really mean this? Do they actually think that if somebody is allowing free speech that is not curated by somebody with a point of view, like Twitter was doing, that the world is going to fall apart and that hate speech is going to take over? I mean, it's ludicrous. And I would even put up with a little bit of hate speech if it meant that Jay Bhattacharya was going to get a chance to stop the lockdowns that were actually really hurting people. I mean, honestly, it's just, we live in insane times, people. We really do. I want to talk to you a little bit about a story that's bubbling around. You can find these people on the internet and maybe support them if you want to. Duke University surgeons are refusing a 14-year-old girl a kidney transplant because she's not received the COVID shot. Seriously. It's unbelievable. At 14, Yulia Hicks has already had more than her share of bad luck. Brought from Ukraine to the United States in December 2018, she was given up by her first two adoptive families before Chrissy and Lee Hicks adopted her in 2021. She suffers from senior Loken syndrome, a genetic condition that is destroying her kidneys and eyes and will soon force her to have a kidney transplant. Now Yulia is facing another crisis, this one seemingly caused by her own physicians. Doctors at Duke University, where Yulia has been awaiting a kidney transplant, have told her parents they will not give her a new kidney unless she is vaccinated against COVID, even though Yulia has already had and recovered from COVID. What's interesting about this story is that Tucker had her mother on the show last night. I believe it was last night, Chrissy Hicks. And she had some audio of the doctors explaining why they would not give Yulia the kidney transplant she so needs. And what was interesting about it was the absolute lack of empathy and humanity in the voice of those people, doctors. And it's something that I've come to fully have taken on board during COVID, that medicine now seems to be kind of medicine practiced by guidelines and rules, right? It's not directed at the individual patient. It's practiced by guidelines and rules. And apparently at Duke University Medical, you can't get a transplant if you haven't had the vaccine, and that's it. There's no wiggle room. You can't, So there may be a petition or something going around, or maybe even a GoFundMe so she can maybe get treatment at another place. But it's really a low blow. I don't understand how people so committed, or allegedly so committed to saving and nurturing human life, could make a decision like this and tolerate a policy like this. It's just very, very disheartening. Okay. Next guest is Jenin Younes, who is on the very, very front lines of the censorship and, I guess, decensorship battle that's underway right now. She's one of the lawyers involved in a case that is representing, amongst other people, Jay Bhattacharya, to find out how much government was influencing big tech. So this week we know what big tech was doing, and this lawsuit that has also been brought by two attorneys general, Louisiana Attorney General Jeff Landry is one of them, seeks to find out if the censorship in big tech was happening by government, and if so, by whom in government. So that's really interesting. And there is a Tony Fauci 7-hour deposition, which I haven't read, but I know that it's out there. And I want to talk to Jenin about that, and also just what all this means for us now. It's all blowing up. And so what are we finding out? What will we find out, does she think? And what does it mean for the future? So here is Jenin. Hi, Jenin. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm really good. Thank you. So I guess you were watching when the stories broke on the COVID side of the Twitter censorship, were you?
Yeah. You mean the Twitter files released by Matt Taibbi and Barry Weiss so far?
Yeah.
I've been reading waiting with bated breath.
It was, for me, I knew it was happening. I've been punished by Twitter myself. And I knew it was happening, but to actually see it in black and white and fully take on board what was happening at this company, obviously at the behest also of other people, it was pretty shocking, even in a very, very cynical time. Did you feel the same way?
Yes. Yeah, I did. I mean, we kind of knew that there were shadow bans and deplatforming, and I actually think that was the case with my own account. There were various indicators of that, and for many, many other people too. But it's stunning to see the words, blacklist, do not amplify, or whatever they were using for these accounts. And for someone like Jay, especially who's an epidemiologist at Stanford, and very measured. He never says anything crazy. I mean, obviously, all of this speech is protected. Even if you say things that are a little out there or that are outright lies, that's protected speech and should not be censored. But it's really stunning to see it in the case of somebody like this.
Yeah, I saw his picture come up on screen, and I thought, "Oh, what is happening here?" It was just really, really shocking. So, for people who don't understand, I want to get into the details of the deposition stuff. But for people who don't understand what you're doing, please explain the lawsuit to our listeners.
Yeah, sure. So the lawsuit basically alleges that the federal government has been involved in big tech censorship. And involved is, I guess, a sort of general word. The basic allegations are that the tech companies were coerced and pressured by the federal government to censor COVID and misinformation, quote unquote misinformation, and other kinds of quote unquote misinformation, again, about the 2020 election, the Hunter Biden laptop story. And we're alleging that that's a First Amendment violation because when the government uses private companies to censor viewpoints, which it can't do directly, right? The government can't pass a law saying, if you think masks don't work and you express that view publicly, you'll be fined or go to jail or lose your Twitter account. The government can't do that. But when the government is sort of using the tech companies as third parties to accomplish that aim surreptitiously, that's effectively the same thing. And that's a First Amendment violation. So what we're trying to prove is that that's what's going on here. Now, it's a little bit tricky because there's also a way of looking at what's going on as more collusion, that the tech companies want to be doing this, that they and the government are working together in order to suppress views that sort of diverge from, I would say, the Democratic Party platform, that this is really all about furthering the Democratic Party's interests. And in that case, the law is less clear in the speech context that that's unlawful. Now, I think that we have doctrines or ways of interpreting the law in other scenarios and other contexts that show that this should also be considered illegal, that tech companies and the government shouldn't be able to work together to suppress viewpoints. So either way, I think it's unlawful, and that's what this lawsuit aims to establish.
Well, obviously people who have Twitter accounts at least should know and be told that it's not a level playing field, right? I mean,
that's right.
Is there fraud seems like a strong word, but actually it's probably an accurate word. But if Twitter is pretending that it is a level playing field politically and in other ways, but then behaving differently, how is that not illegal?
Yeah, so I want to qualify this by saying, I'm more of a constitutional lawyer. I'm not a contract lawyer, which is what this would fall into. And I haven't looked into this extensively. But that being said, off the cuff, I would think since they have said that they're not doing this, right? They're not doing this kind of shadow banning, and they're not stifling speech in this way. I would think it's a violation of their terms of service, because you're someone like Jay, or you're someone like Alex Berenson, who's built up a large Twitter following, who devotes some of significant portion of their time to Twitter, probably getting, earning some of a living off Twitter. Although I know Jay actually doesn't take any money for his COVID work, but maybe somebody like Alex Berenson does. I think you could say, well, I used this platform when you told me that this wasn't happening. I devoted my time and resources to using this platform under the pretense that it wasn't. So you basically lied to me. And I think you could seek damages. I think that if you're not making money for it, I'm not sure what you could do in the contract context, because the only remedy for that is money. If you're raising a constitutional claim, that's different. And then, you're asking a court to say this is a constitutional violation.
Yeah, it's kind of tough, isn't it? I mean, as I was saying in the first hour with Karen, that I remember Jack Dorsey under oath saying, no, we're not doing any of those things. Do you guys believe him when he says that? Karen doesn't, but I'm wondering if you do.
I don't know. It's not clear to me. I don't know. He did say a number of things earlier on that indicated that he's more of a free speech proponent than perhaps some of his successors. But I don't know. It is a little hard for me to believe that he didn't know what was going on. But sometimes that does happen.
Well, and Vijaya, as I was saying earlier, I saw Vijaya on Joe Rogan and thought she was absolutely horrifying. Like she's one of those smug, anti-free speecher, woke people who think that all the bad stuff they do is on the side of God, right? It's like super dangerous, super ideological. Like she could be the minister of truth in the most tyrannical, ideological government and do well, because she wraps herself in virtue while she's doing it.
Yes. That's what they tend to do. I mean, and people have to remember, I frequently, when I'm talking about my cases and stuff, people say, well, what about real misinformation? Yes, I see in the case of Dr. Bhattacharya, it's a problem, but what about the real misinformers? What about the people saying there's a vaccine with the vaccine as a microchip or whatever? And I think people need to remember that someone is doing the censoring, right? There's not some all-knowing God who's in charge of this. It's human beings, the human beings at Twitter, human beings in the government, and they have, they have their own biases, just like we all do, and their own viewpoints. And when you give them the power to censor, you can't draw the lines so easily. It's not, there's this obvious misinformation. And we're seeing the proof of that right now, where people who were expressing extremely truthful, valid views were censored, and that skewed the debate about COVID and has had tragic effects, frankly.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think, I've become a kind of a rabid anti-lockdowner. And even though I'm politically homeless, as I think you probably are too.
Yes.
My one policy, I have two policy planks that if someone agrees with those, I'd probably vote for them. One of them is no more lockdowns ever again under any circumstances, and no being part of the World Economic Forum. I don't want you flying over there and meeting in secret with people. That's not good for, I'm a citizen. I want to know what's going on. So that's what I'm saying. Those are two things that I feel very, very strongly about, because the world we live in right now is so complicated. It's almost impossible to define where I am now in the context of politics. Do you feel the same way?
Yeah, I do. I definitely don't feel as though I belong anywhere. And it's, I'm certainly not a Republican, even though I often find myself at this point in time on the side of Republicans fighting against, COVID restrictions, and now on the, free speech side of things. But I don't, and I don't necessarily think that if the Republicans were in power, they wouldn't be advocating for censorship. Although I will say there was no, and that's some of what the Twitter files showed us. There was no indication that the Republicans as a party or any Republican politicians were pressuring the platforms to censor certain views, while the Biden campaign and the Democratic Party were.
Well, that's interesting. I think it's not because maybe the Republicans are virtuous, but maybe they're too stupid. Right? But no, I mean, on all of this kind of crazy, kind of illegal, awful stuff, right? The kind of futzing about with mail-in ballots and lawfare and all the stuff that the Democrats are so good at, right? The Republicans aren't. They're just not. Like, they've got to figure out mail-in voting. Obviously, they've got to figure it out, right? Yeah, and they just don't know how to do that stuff very well. I always say that the thing that helps Democrats win elections, which is this kind of really cagey, sneaky, kind of right at the line behavior, should also prevent them from governing, right? Like, they're really good at getting elected, but it's the way they do it is so horrific that, you don't really want them making big calls about your life.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah. So I want to talk to you more about the suit. So the two AGs are, as I understand, Louisiana and Missouri, correct? Why did they do this? Why specifically these two people?
It's a good question. I presumably because they saw something wrong here. I mean, there may be a political angle to it as well. The Missouri Attorney General, his office is actually leading the case, the Solicitor General John Sauer is the main one on it. He's running for Senate. He actually was elected, so he's going to be leaving the AG's office and once he's in the Senate. I think there's probably a political component to it in their case, but I also think that they see the horrendous First Amendment violations and implications of not bringing a suit like this and not making sure that we get courts to recognize that the tech companies and the government can't either, the government can't be telling the tech companies what to do and threatening them with consequences if they don't do what the government says in terms of viewpoint-based censorship. And also, the companies and the government can't work together to silence the voices of those who disagree with the government.
Right. I'm wondering if you think that this kind of behavior of government bureaucrats and politicians too, trying to silence ideas that they don't want to deal with, did that play out differently pre-social media? In other words, were they calling the editorial board of the New York Times and saying, you have to stop talking about this, you have to look at it this way? Do we know historically? Or has social media and this kind of youthful, mostly Democrat cohort running this really influential business made it easier for them to behave that way?
I have a sort of multi-pronged answer to that. Yes, the government has in the past told newspapers not to publish things. That's most famously probably the Pentagon Papers case about, about the Vietnam War, where the government was hiding information and lying to the American public. And the New York Times won that case. The Supreme Court said you can't, under the guise of national security, try to hide the dirty things that the government has been doing. And I talked to reporters and they say they do get calls from government officials saying, please don't publish the story. Now, if they're not issuing direct threats, I think they can do that, right? They can say, hey, I think we really prefer if you not publish the story. I think it's better for whatever national security or they can do that. But when they start to issue threats, that's a different thing, because then you're coercing them. But I do think, and I think this is one reason we don't have sort of directly on point law, that social media has created it makes things different, right? If the government goes to the New York Times and says, hey, we'd really rather not publish this story, or we'd rather you not print letters to the editor that express this view, and the New York Times like, okay, that's cool, we won't do that. That doesn't censor the views of people en masse in the way that tech censorship does. Right. So the effect is just much more limited. And so that's why I think that we don't have a lot of First Amendment law addressing this idea of the government using private actors or working with private actors to accomplish mutual aims. So a lot of the most pertinent case law that we're using actually comes more from the Fourth Amendment. That's unlawful or unreasonable searches and seizures. So the government can't search your home or various other aspects of your person without a warrant and probable cause, with certain exceptions. So if the government goes to me and says, hey, we think Trish is committing a crime and we think she's smuggling drugs, but we don't really have any evidence. And we know she's having a party. Can you go over there and just get an invite to the party and check it out. This kind of thing happens. And I'm like, oh, yeah, I don't believe in smuggling drugs either. I'll do that for you. Then I'm a government agent, basically. And I'm, that's all government action. So we see that much more often. And I think those cases are analogous and should be used in this context.
Yeah, I have a theory about it too. So let's go to break, and then I'll tell you what my theory is as a journalist, because I think the difference also is who is the receiver of the request and what is their training about information, right? They don't have the same kind of training about information journalists would. So let's talk about that more. We'll be back in a minute with Jenin Younes.
George Eliason on TNT Radio.
Vladimir Putin was speaking at a meeting with deceased soldiers' mothers, families, and he made a statement that Ukraine doesn't care about their own soldiers. It's not the person that matters, it's the uniform. So if you die, they're going to leave you where you are because you don't matter. That's for people that they like. We've discussed a lot about the people that they don't. If you're in an area that was controlled by the Russian military for any amount of time, and the Ukrainians were forced out of when they came back, they grabbed you and they threw you on the front line because you stayed, and it was against the law for you to stay. And now there are people behind you that they do like with guns pointed at your back, pushing you forward. That's the reality of Ukraine, and that's what cannon fodder means.
George Eliason on today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
When it comes to making plans, you are the best. What about those round trips that you plan in advance, which are perfect on your way there and perfect on your way back? Or those meetings with friends for which you make a group chat 3 months before so that nobody or anything is missing? Or your daughter's first birthday party. You planned it with such dedication that instead of the first, it felt like our 15's. The same way you plan each detail for those moments. Start planning to protect you and your loved ones from a natural disaster. Sign up for local weather and emergency alerts. Prepare an emergency kit. And make a family communications plan. Protecting your family is the best plan you can make. Get started at ready.gov/plan.
Brought to you by FEMA and the Ad Council.
At the top of the hour, we'll keep on top of the news.
It's the most important thing we can do.
On today's News Talk, TNT Radio.
Yeah, Trish Wood here with Jenin Younes, and we're talking about this lawsuit brought by the Louisiana and I believe Missouri attorneys general, which involved a deposition, a 7-hour deposition of Tony Fauci. So I want to talk about that in a minute. But I just wanted to say, Jean, based on what you were talking about, the way that these requests for censorship are received. And I think the difference between getting a request like that in a newsroom versus getting a request like that in a social media company is also, and I don't mean journalists now because who knows what even they're about, but back in the day, like we all took our role very seriously. You know, we used to sit in bars and drink and discuss free speech and how important it was never to be an arm of the government. And, you know, I mean, we that's what we lived and thought about and talked about. And I don't think the people who are working in big tech, specifically Twitter, but also Facebook and other places, have the same relationship with their responsibility for information the way that journalists actually do. They don't have the training. They don't know how to think about free speech. And probably a lot of them aren't that bright and don't think in big kind of, you know, thinky ways about the tough issues of our time, namely free speech. So I think that's the difference. You know, if I was working in journalism, as I did, and somebody called and said, you can't run that story for this reason, I'd be, especially somebody from the government, I'd be much more likely to run it because I'd be mad that they were trying to interfere, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great insight. And to add to that, I think there's also a generational divide. So I think a lot of the, I don't know, I guess Gen Z, people who are now under 30 and tend to be the people who are working at these tech companies, they don't have the same respect for free speech. I think that's gotten lost. they think that, the most important thing is to not be exposed to views that make you uncomfortable or that offend you. Which unfortunately is one of the things you have to learn how to deal with if you want to live in a free society.
Yeah, they just think they're there to make sure everybody feels safe.
Yes.
Okay, let's talk about this, the 7-hour deposition. I do believe I have a transcript of it, but I haven't had a chance to read it yet. What have we learned about Mr. Fauci?
Well, we learned a lot. I would say it was interesting being in a room with him so it was 7 hours of questioning, but because it's sort of intense, you tend to break every hour and 15 minutes for 15 or 20 minutes. So it ended up being a 10-hour thing or something.
What did you think of him in the same room? What was your impression?
It was not terribly different from what I thought of him from, what I'd seen in the media. He is very sure of himself. He does not have any regrets. It doesn't strike me as somebody who's capable of, self-reflection, perhaps thinking that he got something wrong or acknowledging that he got something wrong. He defended all of his policies. I think there were a lot of interesting things that came out. First he claimed he couldn't recall almost everything. So he can't recall specific people or places or emails. And he tends to wrap in I have a very busy day job running a $6.4 billion institute. I don't have time to worry about that. Or I can't possibly remember that study because thousands of studies cross my desk. I get thousands of emails every day or whatever, every week. So there's a little bit of I don't know exactly how you put it, like talking himself
slippery.
Up, I guess. Yeah. And then evading. It's clever because then when he's confronted with an email, he didn't remember emailing Peter Daszak about the lab leak theory or whatever. You can say, well, I just said I didn't remember. I didn't say I didn't, but okay, I guess I did. You're showing me the email now. So it's hard to make a solid case that he's lying, because he just says he didn't remember. For me, one of the most interesting parts was that he said the reason he had decided lockdowns were the right way to go was that his deputy, Clifford Lane, went to China in early 2020 and saw how well they were doing containing the virus through lockdowns. And so we had to implement a similar methodology here. He would sort of call it social distancing. He didn't use the word lockdowns to describe what was going on here, which I think is interesting. He knows it's unpopular. But to my knowledge, he hadn't acknowledged in the past that he got the idea of lockdowns from China, which is interesting for various reasons. I'm sure you know, number one being China doesn't really observe human rights. And then second, of course, it didn't actually work in China. That's why they have lockdowns now for like the 8th or 10th time or something that are spurring protests.
Yeah. So that was quite interesting because you're right. I mean, I am, as I review how we got here, I'm always somewhat confused when you roll back to the very beginning of this and fully understand how completely people in positions of power trusted information coming from China. Like, why would you? I mean, I just don't understand that.
Yes, that's a very interesting question, and we obviously know we can't trust that information.
Yeah.
So that's a third reason. It's
yeah. So it was Clifford Lane went, observed how the lockdowns were working or weren't working, whatever, in China, and came back. And then did he convey that information to Fauci in a note or an email? How do you know what their discussion was? Like, is it documented anywhere around what was said by Lane to Fauci to convince him to do the lockdowns, which I think he now even denies. I think I actually saw him denying that he ever ordered lockdowns, which is, more than I can bear.
Yes.
But
yes, he does deny that. And that's why I think he used the term social distancing. So he said, like, well, they were locking down, and that showed me we had to do something like social distancing here. He was sort of changing the term so that I think he can claim that we didn't actually do lockdowns here. To my knowledge, this was not an email exchange. We don't have the emails, if so. But I got the impression it either took place over the phone or in person with a discussion with Clifford Lane.
Well, it's really shocking how little investigation they did. One of the people who reviewed the transcript says that it became clear to him, at least, that Fauci is a skillful liar. And it's an interesting phrase. It's not one I use a lot about people, but you may or may not remember that I've actually interviewed Tony Fauci myself back in the HIV days in the 80s. Yes. And, and he's slippery as heck. And if you want to lay a glove on him, which means, trying to reveal a moment of truth in an encounter. And we saw this with Rand Paul too, right? Yeah. You struggle with a guy like this because he will deny something that he did or said declaratively. And if you don't have proof that he did or said that thing right at your fingertips to challenge him, and then he'll say, oh, forgot, oh, well, it's really somebody who is that, in my view, immoral in their approach to information and accountability. It's really, really hard to show them up for what they are.
I think that's absolutely right. And, it was funny. I don't know if I've said this publicly, but when we did the deposition at the NIH headquarters in Bethesda, and the security guard, it's a long process to get in. And he asked why we were there. We explained, and he said, oh, Dr. Fauci is a savior. And then the court reporter was basically, trembling with joy at meeting him, and, couldn't tell him enough how happy she was and what a hero he was. And it's stunning to me because watching him, having watched him on TV in the past and just watching him then, it was so clear to me that this is a dishonest, narcissistic, self-aggrandizing person who has no regard for human rights, no regard for civil liberties, and no capacity for self-reflection. So it kind of stuns me that people don't see that, I guess.
Well, and you know what it is? I think, Jenin, I think it's because the media covered him the way the legacy media covered him the way they did. I mean, we still do not see in legacy media coverage the actual victims of the lockdowns, right? We might get a statistic. It's like Solzhenitsyn said that one death is a tragedy and a million is a statistic. And that's kind of the way that legacy media is now covering the damage caused by Fauci's policies around, and other people too, but we're talking about Fauci. Because you just don't see people being interviewed whose kid committed suicide or who are now dying of cancer because their treatment was delayed or, whatever. I mean, the people just are not telling those stories. So he kind of gets away with it because it's all still in Western countries, mostly theoretical, isn't it?
Yes, I think that's right. And, the people who are hardest hit tend to be the ones that liberal elites who are sort of in charge of things don't have to deal with, the working class and poor children and, people with substance abuse issues. Of course, there's still many of those in the elite class as well. But of course, it tends to be more of a problem among poorer people. So I think that's another issue.
How do you explain Fauci's love affair with China? Why? I know that's a big question, but I'm going to go to a break first. I'll go to a break and then we'll come back in a minute and explore that because it's a big question and it's one I really don't know the answer to. So we're back in a moment.
TNT Radio News.
We are your station for news.
This is James O'Neill with a check of today's headlines. A new Twitter Files investigation has revealed the many tools the company executives employed to blacklist and shadow ban conservative voices, which Twitter called visibility filtering. Brittany Griner was freed in a prisoner swap with Russia and is now back home in Texas. England's chief medical officer says the British public needs to change their behavior in order to reduce air pollution, because he claims it's as dangerous as the coronavirus.
St. Joseph's Indian School is much more than a school for Native American children.
It's like a family. Ah! Classes are fun here.
I do want to go.
Okay, good. Okay. I am learning about my culture. I feel safe and loved here. St. Joe's is more than a school for me.
Since 1927, St. Joseph's Indian School has been a safe haven for Native American children to receive the cultural heritage, education, health care, and caring support they need to succeed in life.
As a father, I feel very good about leaving my kids here
They have way more opportunities here.
Learn more at stjo.org today.
Why not give TNT Radio a follow? We're on all major social platforms, including Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Gab, and Getter. Help us get the word out as we cover the biggest topics of our time right here on today's News Talk. TNT Radio. TNT Radio.
Back with Jenin Younes, I left her with a huge question, and it's one that I certainly don't know the answer to, and I'm genuinely curious if you have a hypothesis about Tony Fauci and NIH's love affair with China. How do you think they came to trust them as much as they seemed to at the beginning of COVID?
Well, I mean, it's a good question, one to which I don't know if I have a definitive answer, but I certainly think if you don't respect human rights or civil rights and you think that leaders at the top should be controlling people's daily movements and, basically everything about their lives, I can see why you would have admiration for China.
Yeah, it's really something I don't quite understand. And it's almost, in a sense, it's almost political too, right? Like it feels like the left as it exists now in America is much more forgiving of China, and that it's conservatives who are more concerned about, the dishonesty and the human rights violations, et cetera. It's a really strange, like everybody was in agreement over Tiananmen Square. But since then, it's another political divide that I really can't make much sense out of.
Yeah, I think, and there are people who, one of my clients actually, Michael Sanger, I represent him in a related case, making similar allegations against the federal government. They think that the CCP really has been controlling a lot of what's going on in this country when it comes to lockdowns and sort of trying to get us to adopt their system for their own reasons, because they think we won't be as economically threatening if we are not as free. I haven't looked at that extensively enough to form my own opinion about whether there's enough evidence that that's what's going on, but I certainly think there's at least some influence in that respect.
Well, how was Fauci personally while he was being questioned? Because he is a guy who doesn't like to be questioned. And even though he's slippery, he does, at least he did with me, and he has with Rand Paul, also kind of revealed an arrogance about being questioned. And I'm wondering if you saw that during this deposition.
Yeah. He came across very arrogant. He would clearly get irritated sometimes and sort of hit back a little and say, again, I'm very busy. I have a very busy day job running a $6 billion institute. And I don't have time for social media. I don't have time for the Great Barrington Declaration. But he seemed very confident in his ability to give answers. He did not seem nervous.
Did he at all talk about the collateral damage caused by lockdowns, the risk-benefit ratio? No, he didn't. It's interesting. Scott Atlas, who was in some of those meetings when he was out in Washington, says that they never talked about it. Like, I thought that they wrongly, that they, and here in Canada and in the UK, would be mulling over, well, if we close schools, it's going to be really bad for kids. And does the risk that the virus poses to them actually justify, blah, blah. Nobody was doing any of that, which is shocking to me.
Yes. The one time he was sort of asked about that, he just went to the freezer trucks in New York. There were freezer trucks in New York full of bodies. We had to do something.
Is that what he said?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I was living in New York at the time, actually, so I think I have a pretty good idea of what was going on there. And one of the reasons that there was a higher death toll than there should have been was that Cuomo was, having people go from hospitals with COVID back into the nursing homes, which was just about the worst policy you could come up with.
And they were venting people too, which was killing them. Exactly.
Yeah, that was the other problem. So, but it's not. It's what they do. The lockdown people do is, instead of actually engaging with the ideas or the cost benefit assessment, they just immediately go to this. People were dying. We had to do something, which isn't a really much of a response.
Well, the sad part of what you just said is that news media seems to accept that and supports that idea, right? It's ridiculous.
Yes.
And it's actually quite anti-science. When Fauci says, I am the science, it's quite interesting because as I understand this deposition, he was pretty non-specific about the studies and the data on which he based a lot of his decisions, right? Is it correct that he could not name a single study that said that masks actually did what he was saying they were doing?
That's right. And that was actually another pivotal moment, I guess. He had written emails to a friend in February of 2020, I think towards the end of February. She was worried about COVID and she asked, well, what about masks? Could that help? And he said, no, masks don't help, with respiratory viruses. The particles get through. It doesn't do anything. And then by April 3rd of 2020, so just about 5-6 weeks later, he was telling the public, that masks were this, extremely effective mitigation measure. You should be wearing it, whatever. And he was asked what changed his mind in the interim. And he said, well, there were studies. And he was asked what studies. He couldn't point to one. And there also were no studies conducted in that time. So not even the bad ones that the CDC has been putting out for the last 2.5 years.
Wow, it's just shocking. How frustrating a time we live in where someone who is responsible for so much heartbreak can get away with that. I mean, it's really, there's real hubris around that kind of approach that he can't even name a study.
Yes.
That supports this. I mean, it's just, oh, God.
Yeah. And then, I don't know if you heard about this. It was sort of an interesting juxtaposition. He was asked about hydroxychloroquine, which I always like to look at studies themselves before I have an opinion about something. I don't just accept the word of experts. So I want to say I have not looked extensively at hydroxychloroquine studies, so I don't have that much of an opinion myself. But he was asked why he had, told the public that hydroxychloroquine was not a good idea and not efficacious. And he was confronted with 300 something studies that apparently concluded that it was a good early treatment. And he said, well, they weren't good enough. They weren't randomized controlled studies, so they didn't count. Which is an interesting juxtaposition with the standard he uses for government restrictions, which was my friend went to China and saw that lockdowns worked, so therefore we have to do lockdowns. I don't know. Studies showed that masks work, so we have to use masks. And even though I can't name one. So he seems to be someone who's just very in favor of government restrictions, which makes sense for somebody who's a narcissist and likes to control people, which is the impression I get from him, because that gives, he is the government, not the science, he's the government, but he was able to maintain a lot of control over people's lives by through these restrictions, by advocating for these restrictions.
Well, what's interesting about his comments about the randomized control studies, going back to my experience with him in the late 80s, was about the use of Bactrim to prophylax for pneumocystis carinii pneumonia in people with AIDS. And they were having really good results. The clinicians were. They begged him to put out a bulletin saying, try it. There's no downside, right? It's a sulfur drug. He wouldn't do it without the proper studies, right? 2 years later, he did, but like 17,000 people died in the meantime, right? So he clings to this idea, but look at remdesivir. Obviously, remdesivir was not studied that well because we're finding out that it's quite a dangerous drug now. So his perfect randomized control studies actually do not catch drugs that are even dangerous. So, on one hand, if he is supporting something that's a new on-patent drug, then he finds a reason to support it. But if it's a repurposed drug, then no, we can't do that. It's just wow.
Yeah. I know.
It's nuts. So what is the kind of end game here with the lawsuit? What are you trying to discover? Who else are you going to be deposing? And what's the end game, do you think, going to be for you guys?
Well, okay, so I'll start with the end first. I think what we really want is to establish that the government cannot tell tech companies what to do, cannot threaten them when it comes to viewpoint-based censorship. And that if it does so, that's a First Amendment violation. And perhaps more importantly, because it's sort of much newer territory, that the government and tech companies can't work together to censor certain viewpoints, that's also a First Amendment violation. And I think this is extremely important historically. I mean, if going forward, the government and tech companies can work together to decide that the voices of conservatives or the voices who are critical of virus mitigation tactics or whatever can't be heard. I think that the First Amendment is for all practical purposes dead, or free speech in this country, really. So that's what we're hoping to accomplish in the end. We do have more discovery.
Let me ask you this. Sorry, I just want to ask you this because I didn't.
No, sure.
And it was negligent of me. Did you ask Tony Fauci if he had in any way interacted with the social media companies?
Yes. And, that was technically the goal of the deposition, was to figure out his involvement. Of course, it sort of went more broadly because we were sort of trying to lay the groundwork about what his beliefs were, and what he thought was sort of a valid belief. But he was asked those questions, and especially because, he had exchanged emails with Francis Collins about the Great Barrington Declaration, which two of my clients wrote. So just briefly, for people who don't know, the Great Barrington Declaration was written in October of 2020 by three epidemiologists from Harvard, Stanford, and Oxford, Jay Bhattacharya, Sunetra Gupta, and Martin Kulldorff. And they had been anti-lockdown from the beginning. They said that lockdowns did more harm than good, and that societies should more or less go back to normal while devoting some resources towards protecting the vulnerable. So especially like coming up with ways for nursing homes to be protected, and stuff like that. It was very quickly maligned in the media. And it was also censored on social media. So Facebook took the Great Barrington Declaration's page down. When you looked on Google, it was very hard to find it. And it turned out that Francis and Collins had exchanged these emails around the time it came out, saying, this was very dangerous. These were fringe epidemiologists. We have to do a swift and devastating takedown. Those were Collins's words to Fauci. Now, when Fauci was asked about that, he said, well, I think we just meant we should write a scholarly piece refuting the ideas. We weren't talking about censorship. And he also repeatedly said he doesn't have a social media account. He doesn't have time for social media. He's way too busy developing life-saving vaccines. That was one of the things he said, to have time for social media. So he denied any involvement and pretended, at least claimed, I should say is perhaps the better word, that everything he did was just, refuting the ideas in public, which he's certainly entitled to do, even if I don't agree with his ideas.
Yeah. And what's interesting about what he says there, though, is that actually the word fringe appeared in some media reporting about the Great Barrington Declaration, right? So yes. It's clear to me that Fauci contacted some people and said, this is what we think of this, and here's what you can say. It was the idea that they wanted to let the virus rip, which was false, right?
Yes.
The idea
which
that
he said that again, actually. Yeah, he said that in the deposition. This crazy idea that we could let the virus rip, and he talked about the freezer trucks in New York.
Wow. I just like it's so then the question, Jenin, for you and I is he just BSing us when he talks that way, or is he like really dumb like that? I mean, so if the default is freezer trucks in New York, that's not a very specific response to a very direct epidemiological question, is it?
No, I didn't get the impression that he was dumb. Certainly not when it comes to being able to evade questioning. He certainly has a cleverness to him. And yeah. My read on him, and I could be wrong. This is my my armchair psychology. My read on him is more that he's so arrogant and that he enjoys controlling policy and people, and that's more what it's about. So he'll do anything to defend this, rather than that he's actually just dumb and unable to see the arguments on the other side. But I do think there's probably an obtuseness that comes with wanting to have to implement your preferred policies so much and be unwilling to look at alternative ideas and data. So I guess it's a mixed bag.
So where are you going then? I interrupted you. You were telling me what your goal is. Yeah.
Yeah, so the goal was, as I said, to sort of establish that this kind of thing can't happen, that it's a First Amendment violation. So going forward, the government and tech companies cannot do this. In terms of future depositions, we actually have some interesting ones coming up. Jennifer Psaki, she should be deposed, and so she fought hers a bit. The latest is that the lower court denied all of her motions to quash the subpoena. She could try to get a writ of mandamus in the Fifth Circuit. I don't think she's going to do that at this point. I'm guessing, but she could. So that's supposed to take place in January. The court had initially ruled that we could depose the Surgeon General, which I think was very important because the Surgeon General is one of the key people. He was saying, we want to hold these companies accountable if they don't censor people who spread misinformation about COVID. And by misinformation about COVID, too, we have to be clear that we're talking about things. He cited like questioning whether social distancing works, questioning whether masks work, which are completely valid views. Although the First Amendment also protects people saying that the vaccine has a microchip, which I obviously do not think is true. But so unfortunately, the court said after reconsideration, he was going to have us depose the Murthy's chief of staff, the Surgeon General's chief of staff, rather than the Surgeon General himself. But Jen Psaki is an important one because she was also on the record, publicly saying, we're working with the tech companies. We're telling them what to flag. We're making sure they know that there are going to be consequences if they don't do this. So we want to know more about that.
Yeah, that's interesting. She'll probably tell you she's going to circle back.
Well, it was funny because she initially tried to quash. It's very complicated, but the case is in the Western District of Louisiana, but you can't force a witness to go more than 100 miles for a deposition. So she lives in the Virginia area. So she moved to quash the subpoena in the Eastern District of Virginia, which is a sort of procedural loophole that can allow people to get a second bite of the apple, so to speak. So she tried to get another ruling from a different judge of a district court. And the judge there did not like her claims. She was sort of claiming she's too busy. It would take her away from her family. And the judge said, well, the deposition's occurring where she lives. So, I mean, presumably she's away from her family during the workday anyway. What difference does it make? And then she couldn't cite, she said it would be an undue burden, but couldn't cite anything specific. And he said, well, I don't want to just keep hearing it's an undue burden. What's the undue burden? I mean, and nobody likes doing a deposition. Who does she think she is, kind of? So she did not win that.
Well, that should be really entertaining. And then when is this going to wrap up? Like you're taking depositions. Does this lead to a trial of some sort, or what happens next?
That's the idea. It could be summary judgment. So the judge could decide, the parties could move to have this decided on the facts that we have now, which I think there's a chance that could happen. So initially the depositions they were supposed to wrap up by December 23rd, but because the government was appealing some of them, things got delayed. So now that they have to be done by, I think, January 23rd. And then after that, we should get a ruling on the preliminary injunction, that's what the stage this is at. It's actually at a very early pretrial stage. So I'm hoping, we could get a ruling in the early spring, say March.
And so what would the ruling be? What if they rule in your favor? What is the ruling itself?
Well, on a preliminary injunction, sort of probably boring lawyer stuff, but you're basically arguing that this is an emergency thing. We don't, what's going on now is causing irreparable harm to the plaintiff. So a violation of your First Amendment rights that's ongoing is an irreparable harm in and of itself. So this doesn't have time to go through the full trial process. The court needs to immediately stop what's going on. And then in the interim, after that, I guess, subsequently you go through the entire trial process. So the ruling on the preliminary injunction. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, so who are the plaintiffs? I know Jay is one, and who else?
Jay and Martin, and then Aaron Cariotti, who was a professor at UC Irvine before he got fired for not getting the vaccine. Ironically, he's a professor of medical ethics. And Jill Hines, a woman who runs an organization in Louisiana called Health Freedom Louisiana. And there's another plaintiff named Jim Hoft who we're not representing. And then the states represent the citizens of their states. So Missouri is suing on behalf of its citizens, as is Louisiana.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so sorry, when do you think you might have some kind of a ruling?
I would say February would be the earliest.
And then what would March the ruling do? March is likely. And so what would it do? The ruling would do what?
It would be a court order saying that the government can't do this. And there are different iterations. So the court could say, well, the government can't threaten the tech companies, but if the tech companies and the government want to work together to accomplish mutual aims, they can do that, which I'm hoping we don't get. I don't think that would be particularly great. It would be better than nothing. Yeah. Or the court could say, if the tech companies the government can't threaten the tech companies as it's been doing. And also if the tech companies are going to work with the government, then they are government actors and they can be held liable as such. So if the tech companies are smart, they would actually get out of this business because it's not good for them.
Yeah, they've got to go back to, if they ever were, they've got to go back to being something even resembling neutral. And I'm sure if you there's probably some good people in tech, and they may be thinking, well, we're doing a public service, and it's sort of like, like a PSA, that we're helping public health get the word out. And like I said earlier, they don't understand that you have a responsibility as a kind of a broker of information to make sure that you're not carrying water that's harmful for people, right? And I don't think they'll ever figure that out. I think they just don't get it. Yeah. And I think it's because, as we talked about, this club of young people do not understand the downside of not having a free media. And certainly we've seen it. I guarantee that people died as a result of the censorship on Twitter and social media.
Oh, for sure.
They did. There's no question about it. And if anybody will ever say that straight out is another thing, but who knows? Anyway, Jenin Younes, thank you so much for doing this, and thank you for the lawsuit. It's really very, very interesting stuff.
Oh. So thank you so much for having me back, Trish. It's always fun to talk.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, same here. Okay, thanks. Bye.
Okay, bye.
And bye-bye. And I'm Trish Wood saying goodbye. And you can hear me on my podcast, which is trishwoodiscritical.com. And my website is trishwoodpodcast.com. So I'll see you next week. Bye.